100 days, American families are paying more and getting less, and this trend continues. States have already testified that the president's disruption in water infrastructure financing was having an impact on local redevelopment projects, resulting in project delays, increased cost, and the potential abandonment of local projects. This uncertainty is equally felt within the Brownfields community and made worse by the president's proposal to cut the Environmental Protection Agency's investments by a minimum of 65%. This Republican economic chaos threatens the jobs of laborers, manufacturers, and brownfields redevelopers, and threatens to decimate our national, regional, and local economies. Our communities cannot withstand further setbacks caused by the Republicans' efforts to drive our economy into the ground. We cannot allow the president and his allies to hurt American families and increase costs and public health risks. I stand with our communities who are trying to affordably meet their local needs and keep our families safe, healthy, and prosperous. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I would now like to welcome our witnesses and thank you for being here today. We have the Honorable Terry Wilbur from Oswego County, is the Oswego County Clerk on behalf of the National Association of Counties. There, I didn't butcher it. We also have Ms. Lisa Shook, Assistant Chief of the Environmental Response and Remediation Division of the Ohio EPA. Mr. Lance Larson, Analyst in Environmental Policy at the Congressional Research Service, and Mr. Michael Goldstein, Managing Partner at the Goldstein Environmental Law Firm. Briefly, I'm going to take just a moment to explain our lighting system. As you know, there's 3 lights there. The green is when you begin to talk. The yellow will light up as it gets near the end of the time. And of course, if it turns red, then go ahead and please wrap up so that we don't have to bang the gavel on you. But I also ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Mr. Wilbur, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chair. Chair Collins, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity today. My name is Terry Wilbur, and I serve as the County Clerk for Oswego County, New York. Today, I'm here on behalf of the National Association of Counties, who represents all 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs throughout the country, including all 62 in my home state of New York. Today's hearing is of great importance to counties as we are responsible for protecting the environment, ensuring public health, and strengthening the economic vitality of our communities. The EPA Brownfields program is a highly effective federal program that helps counties redevelop underutilized contaminated sites to reinvigorate communities and their economies as well. There are over 450,000 brownfield sites, and 63% of counties have at least one brownfield site. However, many counties have more than one brownfield site, including my county, Oswego County, where we have 125 sites. As many of you know, a brownfield site is an abandoned or vacant property that has been exposed to hazardous substances or contaminants. Brownfield sites range from former industrial complexes to older public buildings and even smaller properties such as former gas stations. While the presence of brownfield sites can present land use challenges and negatively impact property values, redevelopment can spur economic growth and revitalize the surrounding environment. Oswego County is a rural county located in upstate New York that borders Lake Ontario with a population of 118,000 residents. Oswego County has received 2 Brownfields assessment grants, one in 2004 and another in 2022. This funding has been used to identify the 125 brownfield sites that we have and conduct the environmental site assessments necessary for redevelopment at several sites. Some completed brownfield assessments and projects in Oswego County include 2 housing developments on the Oswego riverfront, the Stephen Dorr Lofts and Harborview Apartments that together created 108 housing units and 5 commercial leasing spaces with a total investment of $30 million. We were also able to leverage brownfield assessment funding to receive grant funding from the state to restore the historic Oswego Lighthouse, which is now open for the public tours in the heart of our major city. The federal investment from the Brownfields program is crucial for both urban and rural counties. In Oswego County, we would not have been able to complete this work without the Brownfield fundings we received. To that end, counties have the following recommendations for the committee. Our first recommendation is to reauthorize the Brownfields program. Congress should reauthorize the Brownfields program to ensure that this critical source of federal funding remains available to counties for brownfields assessments, cleanup, and redevelopment, as well as providing incentives for private investment in our communities. Our second recommendation is to increase funding levels for the Brownfield program. Congress should increase the overall authorization level for the Brownfields program to allow more counties to address brownfield sites. In many states, counties are severely constrained in our ability to both raise and collect tax revenues. However, counties must still deliver essential services to our residents and visitors despite these limitations. Counties are very grateful for the additional funds provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for the Brownfields program. However, there is still a clear need for increased funding as thousands of sites are still waiting to be redeveloped. Additionally, NACO recommends increasing the cleanup grant ceiling to $1 million and the flexibility to award up to $2 million due to complexity of the cleanup process and to allow communities to clean up more sites. Our third and final recommendation is to increase the administrative cap on Brownfields program grants. Congress should allow counties to use a small portion of their brownfield funding to cover reasonable administrative costs. Many rural counties face difficulties in accessing federal funds as they have limited staff, expertise, and financial resources available to complete these complex grant applications or to comply with the burdensome reporting. In conclusion, counties recognize the Brownfields programs as a vital component of the intergovernmental partnership to drive economic development, address environmental concerns, and protect public health. I would also like to thank the U.S. Conference of Mayors and National League of Cities who've been great partners in our joint efforts to reauthorize the Brownfield program. Thank you for your attention to this critical issue, and I urge your support for reauthorization of the Brownfields program. And I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Shook, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to share Ohio's perspective on the reauthorization of US EPA's Brownfield program. Across Ohio and the United States, thousands of former industrial and commercial sites sit idle, tainted by environmental contamination. These brownfields become urban blights and contribute to economic decline, public health risks, and neighborhood stagnation. The Brownfield program, administered by US EPA, offers a consistent and effective solution. The program facilitates the identification, assessment, cleanup, and reuse of these properties, revitalizing communities and stimulating economic growth. State and tribal assistance grants are non-competitive grants authorized under Section 128A of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act as amended. These grants are the foundation of states' brownfields programs. US EPA allows states flexibility to design their brownfield programs to benefit each state's needs while also providing consistency by requiring that all grantees meet 4 elements. The first is a survey and inventory of brownfield sites. Second is oversight and enforcement authorities to ensure that cleanups are protective of human health and the environment. Third is mechanisms for meaningful public participation. And fourth is mechanisms for approval of cleanup plans and verification or certification that cleanup is complete. With these four elements, the 128A funds have a wide variety of uses, including providing funds to complete environmental assessments to properties to meet all appropriate inquiry or voluntary cleanup program requirements, Phase 2 sampling, and asbestos and lead inspections. Last federal fiscal year, Ohio funded 20 assessments through our standard allocation and 63 through our supplemental allocation provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The grant enables the state to incorporate local input into redevelopment planning, including infrastructure evaluations, site reuse assessments. This effort aims to help communities reinvent their lake and riverfronts, main streets, and industrial corridors, creating parks, housing, mixed-use development, and commercial centers to stimulate job creation, tourism, and tax revenues. This community-driven approach ensures that redevelopment serves the people most affected by these long-neglected properties. For example, in Shadyside, Ohio, we are working with the community to develop a Brownfield vision plan that includes a Brownfield inventory, market study, community outreach, survey of brownfields, site reuse renderings, and a resource roadmap of how to move forward with the selected projects. We recently completed a Brownfield vision plan in Bel Air, Ohio, where we are now working on a reuse assessment to create viable reuse scenarios for their downtown corridor. Our program supports local officials in preparing grant applications for the competitive Brownfield grants by providing workshops to further build their capacity to apply for and hold federal grants. And for the last round of grant applications, we supported 14 communities in applying for their own Brownfield grants. These workshops also educate local communities about the many Brownfield issues and incentives that are available at the state and federal level. We routinely meet with community officials and others to assist them in working through the assessment and cleanup of brownfield properties and provide much-needed grant-funded technical support and recommendations. Last federal fiscal year, Ohio Brownfield staff met with 60 communities, gave 12 presentations on brownfield issues, and provided 18 communities with grant-funded technical assistance. The grant also supports the state's voluntary cleanup programs, which provide the foundation for setting cleanup goals and implementing institutional controls. In Ohio, our voluntary cleanup program was created in 1994. We call it the Voluntary Action Program. To date, the Voluntary Action Program has achieved cleanup at 750 sites, allowing over 17,000 acres to be reused across Ohio. The grant allows us to fund long-term oversight activities to ensure these sites remain protective of human health and the environment. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided an additional $50 million through a competitive community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes. In federal fiscal year 2022, Ohio was awarded nearly $2 million to conduct additional assessments. With these funds, Ohio's Brownfield program has completed another 62 assessments within the award period for a total of 145 assessments over our 3 grants. Since 2023, Ohio's 128A funds and community-wide assessment grant have leveraged $54 million in additional state-funded brownfield assessment and cleanup dollars. And prior evaluations by US EPA show that over $20 was leveraged for each dollar of EPA brownfield funds spent on assessment and cleanup activities. The Brownfield program is a great example of how environmental cleanup and economic revitalization are not competing priorities, but complementary goals that can help build a stronger future for all Americans. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Larson for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Lance Larson. I'm an analyst in environmental policy with the Congressional Research Service. Thank you for inviting me today to testify on behalf of CRS regarding the federal Brownfields program. In serving Congress on a nonpartisan and objective basis, CRS takes no position on these issues. I have been asked by the subcommittee today to provide a broad overview of the federal Brownfields program, including a brief history of the program, liability considerations, and other policy matters for Congress. Enacted in 1980, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, otherwise known as the Superfund Law, authorizes environmental cleanup and enforcement actions to respond to actual or threatened releases of hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants into the environment. Under CERCLA, the US EPA, in coordination with the states, prioritizes the cleanup of contaminated sites on non-federal lands under the federal Superfund program. In 1993, EPA established a pilot initiative under the Superfund program to assist communities with the remediation of certain lower-risk contaminated sites to encourage or facilitate economic redevelopment or reuse. EPA referred to these properties as brownfields to distinguish them from both higher-risk contaminated sites designated on the National Priorities List under the Superfund program and from other sites where federal response actions were taken to address emergency situations. In 2002, Congress amended CERCLA to authorize EPA to administer a dedicated brownfields program separately from the Superfund program. In 2018, Congress enacted the BUILD Act, which amended CERCLA to reauthorize the brownfields program. The BUILD Act extended the authorizations of appropriations through FY 2023, among other statutory changes to the program. As it functions today, the Federal Brownfields Program provides grant assistance to state, local, tribal governments, and nonprofit organizations for the assessment and cleanup of potentially contaminated sites. CERCLA defines eligible brownfield sites as real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. CERCLA generally excludes sites from brownfields grant eligibility that are addressed under the Superfund program or under other related federal cleanup programs and authorities. Subject to the availability of appropriations, the Federal Brownfields Program provides two types of grants: those that EPA awards on a competitive basis for assessment and cleanup of eligible brownfield sites, and those that are awarded on a formula basis to assist states and tribes in carrying out their own cleanup programs. Congress funds these grants annually through the discretionary appropriations process. The Brownfields Program statutory authorities do not have a sunset date. However, authorization for appropriations for the Brownfields programs, grants expired at the end of FY 2023, and Congress has continued to appropriate funding annually to implement the Brownfields program. Annual appropriations have been less than authorized amounts and have remained relatively constant in nominal terms since FY 2003. In addition to prior appropriations, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided an additional total of $1.5 billion over a 5-year period through FY 2026. CERCLA provides a mechanism to compel potentially responsible parties to pay for the cleanup of hazardous substances. CERCLA established financial liability for those parties, which may include current or former owners and operators of a site, generators, and parties that arrange for the transport, disposal, and treatment of hazardous substances, and transporters of hazardous substances to a facility. These categories of parties are generally prohibited from obtaining a Brownfields grant. However, Congress amended CERCLA to provide certain liability exemptions designed in tandem to work with the Brownfields program. If Congress considers reauthorization in this session, as it has done in the past, Congress may consider certain elements of this Brownfields program, such as the duration of reauthorization, statutory caps on grant amounts, criteria for assessing grant applications, and past and future expected program outcomes. This concludes my prepared statement. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today. I'd be happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Goldstein for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Collins, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the committee. My name is Michael Goldstein. I'm the managing partner of the Goldstein Environmental Law Firm, a principal of Goldstein Kine Environmental, a past president of the Florida Brownfields Association, and past chair of the National Brownfield Coalition's Public Policy Committee. It is a distinct honor to participate in this hearing and share suggestions on how to build on what has been the most important, impactful, and results-producing federal program in my 33 years of practice. While Congress and every state government in the nation, including the great state of Florida, have supported brownfields work since the mid-1990s, the hundreds of thousands of brownfields across the country require additional federal resources. My remarks today are informed by over 3 decades of assisting local governments, developers, growers, manufacturers, schools, and capital providers navigate the risks of cleaning up and redeveloping contaminated land. I also invest in them personally and accordingly have a 360-degree view of what aspects of the federal brownfields program have worked well and where opportunities remain to overcome persistent challenges. The private sector wants to do more, but we need more help from Congress. I would like to speak first to Florida's Brownfield program, which was an early leader nationally in encouraging environmental redevelopment. Florida's program was enacted on July 1, 1997, and in the ensuing 28 years has sparked the creation of 90,000 indirect and direct jobs and the investment of over $3.18 billion. Through February of this year, local governments have designated 613 brownfield areas totaling 290,000 acres. Over 530 voluntary cleanup agreements have been executed. Over 235 brownfield sites have been cleaned up. Florida has accomplished this outstanding result with a mix of economic incentives, including tax credits and tax refunds, a loan guarantee fund, liability protection at the state level, and a streamlined regulatory review process. It's with this model in mind that the following 7 specific recommendations are made. First, as part of a forthcoming bipartisan tax bill, renew the federal brownfield tax incentive, which was passed in 1997 to allow parties who voluntarily investigate and remediate contaminated properties to deduct all cleanup costs on their federal income tax return in the year they spend money on cleanup. Second, create a Brownfields Loan Guarantee Program. This program would combine aspects of the Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program with the New Markets Tax Credit Program to leverage billions of private sector dollars for early-stage bridge financing of redevelopment projects that are considered too risky for conventional lenders. Third, prioritize affordable housing built on brownfield sites by amending Section 42 of the IRS Code to increase the low-income housing tax credit to 12%, the stepped-up basis to 150%, and to create a new one-time LIHTC in the amount of 80% of the cost of land acquisition and demolition. Fourth, dramatically increase flexibility for EPA grant program users by eliminating the match requirement, expanding allowable expenses to include demolition and environmental insurance, and for the first time ever, making all such grants available to for-profit developers of affordable and workforce housing. That would be a game changer. Fifth, increase the maximum grant awards to local governments and not-for-profit applicants to expand the amount of work and magnitude of cleanup that each grant awardee can accomplish. Sixth, increase the CERCLA 128 grants to state brownfields programs. Since inception of Florida's Brownfield program, the Department of Environmental Protection has been awarded $17.2 million in 128A grant funds. The awarded monies have allowed DEP to conduct targeted assessment and remediation at over 116 of the highest priority sites. Speaking from personal experience as a 128A grant recipient, these grants are powerful, effective, and catalytic. In our situation, Goldstein Kite Environmental partnered with DEP to conduct assessment and remediation of chlorinated solvents at a former chemical storage and distribution site that impacted a public school. Our investment in this extensively contaminated site and DEP and EPA's co-investment with $400,000 in 128A grant funds is facilitating construction of 515 units of affordable housing and a $217 million capital expenditure in the Overtown neighborhood of Miami by one of the largest builders in the country. A final recommendation, PFAS is commonly referred to as the forever chemical. It's really the everywhere chemical, and it's having a monumental impact on brownfields development, where the listing of PFAS as a CERCLA hazardous substance raises the specter of possible EPA-led cleanups under the National Contingency Plan over decades at great expense. Congress should consider a statutory exemption to CERCLA where a party has voluntarily entered into a brownfield cleanup agreement with the state agency to remediate PFAS contamination under state law. The exemption would provide immunity from CERCLA cost recovery and contribution claims, a hold on NPL status, immunity from RCRA citizen suits, and express immunity from lenders. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present my comments.
Thank you, and thank you all for providing your testimony. We will now turn to questions for the panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I kind of like to give you an idea of what I look at things, especially from a chairman's standpoint. And, and the way I look at it, in November, the American people spoke loud and clear. First of all, they need to save taxpayer dollars. The second thing that we need to do up here, especially from a chairman's standpoint, is make sure that the federal government is very productive and efficient. And if we can do that, then we will save taxpayer money. You all had testimony, and as you were giving your testimony, I started changing my questions as each one of you went through. So some of this may be a little choppy, but I want to make sure that whatever we do, if you think of it in what can we do to be more efficient? How do we save money? And in this case, when we make an investment, what's the return on the dollar for that investment? Because a lot of this I look at as an investment instead of just a grant money. So, Mr. Larson, I think this may be best for you. If it's not, if somebody else wants to weigh in or not. The IIJA, $1.5 billion extra over 5 years, over the normal allocation, if I've got that right. And if I'm wrong, correct me. How was that doled out among the states? Was that on a first-come, first-served basis? Large states got this, small states, or how did that work?
So thank you for the question. So the IIJ funding was divided, of that total $1.5 billion, $1.2 billion was allocated for the Section 104 grants, the 104K grants, so the competitive grants. So those grants were administered in the same, similar fashion as in the similar criteria that EPA uses toward their annual competitive grants. So that's the grants that go to eligible applicants through the normal process, or that normal.
So that money goes to the states. So
that's the money that goes directly to the applicants.
okay. So who actually primarily provides the funding? Is it local, state, Fed? What?
So there's the competitive grants,
Yeah.
which are appropriated to EPA, and EPA administers that on a competitive basis. So there's a collection of eligible entities all over the country that will put in various grant applications for those grants. And so EPA will look at all the grant applications that will come in, and based upon the criteria that's in statute, they have this ranking prioritization process. And as part of that, they'll administer those grants to those eligible entities.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if we doubled the money essentially over 5 years, and I hear it consistent that it's not funded at the level. And of course, in my opening statement, I said just throwing money at a problem is not going to solve the problem. We've always figured that out. There's usually something else in there. And Honorable Wilbur, just you said that I think it was you. Who is it that said burdensome reporting? That said that it was burdensome reporting was one of the problems.
Yeah. So
Is that on the Fed or the state level or the local level? Where's that burdensome reporting?
we had that for the Brownfield assessment program that we had, that came from the feds. And what it is we just have a small staff. I mean, we have a small county with under 1,000 employees, and we're actually, I would say, probably one of the larger rural counties, if you will.
Yeah.
And as you get smaller and smaller, there's less staff to be able to put the time to devote to this.
And to me, I think that gets to the crux of the problem of a lot of the problems we hear up here, especially with rural counties. A lot of my district is very rural. They don't have stacks of accountants and lawyers sitting around to apply for grants. They have to go out and pay for the grant, which costs them, 30, 40% of the money, whatever they can get away with. And so I've always been a bigger proponent of we just block grant money and get out of the way. And that's where I was getting at. Is it a federal issue on what, because a lot of times when the feds give out money, they got strings attached. A lot of times they're around your neck. So, if that's the case, then is there an issue with the feds getting in the way?
If I may, I would say that I think we've proven it in Oswego County over the 2 rounds of grants that we've received, $900,000. Out of those 2 particular parcels that I mentioned, that's a $30 million investment of basically wasteland on a environmental protected area, meaning it was on a river in our downtown area.
Right, and I want to bring that up real quick. So that $30 million investment that the taxpayers made, what was the return on the dollar tax-wise?
Let me just correct that. That wasn't a $30 million taxpayer investment.
Yes,
that
sir.
was a private investment. So we used the $900,000 to leverage the $30 million investment from private.
Okay, but there again, okay, so the $900,000, what was the tax advantage? What did it do to generate taxpayer? Did y'all look at that? How much more taxes it generated? Obviously, it wasn't doing much of anything with its Brownfield.
I don't have the exact figures on what those buildings are assessed at it right now, but they're back on the tax rolls. Those properties are generating thousands in tax revenue.
Yeah, and that's the type stories I like to hear is if we make an investment in something, how long does it take for us to get our return, and what has our return been? because anytime we can generate more taxpayers out there, then it generates revenue to replace what we spent out. All right, I'm out of time. I yield back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes.
Ms. Shook, last Friday, the Environmental Council of the states wrote a letter to EPA Administrator Zeldin that I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record. Into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
In this letter, the Executive Board of State Environmental Leaders expressed deep concern with the President's budget proposal to eliminate or drastically cut most categorical grant programs within the agency, including the Clean Water State Revolving Trust. The states warned that these cuts would hurt efforts to reinvest in our nation's infrastructure, damage our public and environmental health, and threaten our economy. While EPA's Brownfield program was not specifically mentioned in the President's budget, it is conceivable that funding for this program is equally as targeted by the administration for reduction or elimination. Ms. Shook and then Mr. Goldstein, what would be the consequences for the state of Ohio and the state of Florida if all EPA Brownfield grants funding were eliminated? Ms. Shook?
Thank
Thank you, Congresswoman Wilson, for the question. In many instances, in most instances, EPA Brownfields funding is existential. Without that seed money, thousands of environmental redevelopment and reuse projects all across the country would come to a grinding halt, and those that are in the planning process wouldn't even get out of the gate. These are projects that help to accelerate remediation, to quickly reduce public health risk that result in a tremendous amount of job creation, economic revitalization, and additional tax revenues to local governments that can then provide more services and also increase redevelopment in the surrounding area. They turn engines of disinvestment into productive engines of investment, and without continued funding, even expanded funding through EPA, all of that work would come to a halt.
Shook?
I'd agree with Mr. Goldstein. It would negatively impact almost every community in Ohio. Our state funding supports a lot of our smallest and most rural communities because they have the least capacity to hold their own grants, whereas our larger communities use this as a catalyst to get other federal funds, other state dollars. Ohio has a robust cleanup program themselves to partner for matching dollars for those funds. They use federal funds, and to incite additional private investment. It is much easier. There's plenty of green space in Ohio for companies to come in and to keep those investments in our communities where the infrastructure already exists and to preserve our farmland. It is nice to have a robust brownfield program to keep that development in our more populated areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein, our home county, Miami-Dade, has highlighted the successes it has seen with the Brownfields program. They talked about the efforts at Thermo Fisher and how the Brownfield designation helped create new jobs. They also spoke about the Poinciana Industrial Center effort and how Brownfield pilot helped address remediation needs in the community. Can you discuss the importance of continued support for the Brownfields program and how this funding will help address Brownfield sites like the corner of Northwest 37th Avenue and Northwest 183rd Street in Miami Gardens?
Yes, Ranking Member Wilson. That part of Miami-Dade County has long been subject to disinvestment, economic blight, and unfortunately, historically, civil unrest related to the lack of economic opportunity. A significant component of that is driven by the environmental uncertainty and risk associated with a long history of industrial activities like pesticide distribution plants that have left a significant amount of soil and groundwater contamination that has candidly provided a tremendous disincentive to lenders and other investors to imagine what that area could be, which is surrounded by working families who love their community and want an opportunity to raise their families there and have good jobs. With EPA's investment and the continued oversight of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the Miami-Dade County Department of Environmental Resources Management, utilizing federal resources, there is an opportunity for developers to come in, create jobs, create affordable housing, and turn that part of the community into a very vital portion of Miami-Dade County that generates a tremendous amount of economic activity.
Thank you, Mr. Goldstein, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for the time.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry I wasn't, I was wanting to, I should have stopped in. If y'all get a chance, just please remember to cut your mic off. That when we had that noise that crept in, there was 2 mics open, so if you'll make sure it's off if you're not talking, we won't have that. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the committee, Mr. Taylor from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Collins and Ranking Member Wilson, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to share their insight and for the sacrifices you made to be here. I want to especially welcome Ms. Shook, who's here to talk about how Ohio has succeeded in turning contaminated land into residential and economic growth. Toxic materials such as asbestos and lead in old buildings can cause significant harm to those exposed over long periods of time. That is why the Brownfield program exists, to turn older toxic sites into productive and beneficial areas in the community. In Southern Ohio, the main brownfield sites include schools, children's homes, and other public buildings. It should be obvious that small rural communities face massive challenges when addressing brownfield sites in their region, such as constrained local budgets, fewer people available to manage brownfield projects, and limited access to technical expertise. Ms. Shook, can you elaborate on how the Ohio EPA has worked with rural communities to alleviate these challenges?
Thank you. The state's program works significantly with our smaller and more rural communities. As I said earlier, they have less capacity to hold their own grants to be competitive in the 104K competitive rounds of grants. So we are often sort of the front door for them to the brownfield space. They can use our funding for planning purposes as well as the initial assessments, and we can work with them and do work with them very closely to help prepare them to potentially apply for either another state grant or a federal grant as they get ready. So we've done everything from helping them develop their own brownfield inventories to doing phase 1 environmental assessments for them to helping set up community meetings and do community surveys on what they would like areas to look like after a brownfield redevelopment is completed. So that's a variety of ways we work with them, but they are a primary customer of ours.
Gotcha. Is there more that Congress could do to remove barriers that create these challenges for rural areas?
Yes, so the competition process is very competitive. We've heard numbers around only about 30% of applicants get approved for their grants. So finding ways to provide more funds to more communities would make it easier for them to hold. Our regional brownfield staff that manage those assessment grants do a very nice job of helping those communities follow all the regulations and reporting requirements, as well as they assist us in making sure we're aware of any new requirements that we have to meet for our 3 grants that we hold. So we have a great working relationship with Region 5 staff that help us with that, but you know, there's always more tools in the toolbox for small communities who don't have the staff to hold grants, or allowing states to hold larger grants so that we can do more work for them and we bear the responsibility for the reporting requirements.
Thank you. With Congress and President Trump vowing to rein in government spending, it is important that Congress evaluates how we fund these existing programs. Mr. Goldstein, in your testimony, you highlighted how public-private partnerships benefited local communities in cleaning up brownfield sites. Can you elaborate on the benefits of public-private partnerships and how that speeds up brownfield sites being cleaned up?
Absolutely. Many times, most times, local governments and local government entities own contaminated assets, old landfills, public utility facilities, wastewater treatment plants. They're sitting on these assets. They cost a tremendous amount of money to maintain, and the funds aren't there to clean them up and repurpose them. And so what they do is they reach out to the private sector for a public-private partnership opportunity. The private entities are beneficiaries of the EPA grants that come in, but those dollars, while important, aren't always directly available to the private sector entities, and frequently they're not enough to complete the cleanup and put the site on a level playing field with greenfield sites. So what would be most important is to, A, expand the grant opportunities in terms of the dollars that are available. That's number one. Number two, make them available directly to the private sector who are operating in areas that the government wants to see, like public-private partnerships, like affordable housing. That's number two. And number three, utilize some of the other tools that Congress has available to it to increase the likelihood of success of public-private partnerships, like creating more liability exemption opportunities, for example, with respect to PFAS, or providing this federal income tax deduction to private sector entities, which results in more dollars that can go into the redevelopment side.
Thank you, and thank all of you for being here today. And Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'm good with no questions.
Sir?
I am good with no questions.
Oh, okay.
Move on to the next Democrat.
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sykes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member, for yielding your time for me to ask questions. It is certainly Ohio Week in Transportation Infrastructure Committee, so good to see you, Ms. Shook. Thank you for being here today. And thank you to the Chair and Ranking Member for holding this hearing. Ohio has long been a leader in industrialization for generations, and for many folks in my district, that's meant investment in our communities and good-paying jobs, and my hometown, Akron, is known as, or maybe formerly known as, the rubber capital of the world. But unfortunately, it's also left our state and my district with far too many derelict and dangerous sites, especially in the absence of environmental regulations, and industries have shifted over the years. Following some of these, we've been fortunate to have the identification and support around brownfield sites, and the properties damaged to the environment and dangerous for families and clearly unsuitable for business, which makes some of these properties unavailable for productive use. There are more than 4,200 brownfield properties across the state of Ohio, and every single of our 88 counties have at least one brownfield property, and my district is no exception. There are 110 properties that have been identified at brownfield sites in Ohio's 13th district alone. Of these sites, one of them is the Landmark Building in Akron, Ohio. It's right downtown. Actually, our district office is almost directly across the street from it. It was a significant part of our downtown skyline, previously the home to Akron Savings and Loan, but this building has been abandoned. But in 2011, the Department of Development received brownfield cleanup grants from the EPA and was able to leverage some fundings, and now, fast forward to 2025, it is a productive property, Akron's new Bowery District development, and home to apartment buildings, restaurants, and productive land use, which is exactly what we want these programs to do. Additionally, Rolling Acres Mall, if you've ever seen mall wastelands, Rolling Acres is one of those. It is now an Amazon distribution site. Again, another way in which you've been able to use brownfield development to encourage job growth and development and economic opportunity in our communities. Ms. Shook, in your testimony, you talked about you have identified and worked with just under 100 communities and brownfield sites across the state. I just mentioned that I have 110 in my district alone, so obviously that means that there is a lot of demand and not enough support around it, but the bipartisan infrastructure law did provide a much-needed boost for remediating some of these sites. So if you could talk a little bit more about what this investment and increased investment could do across the state of Ohio specifically, and how this can increase and encourage economic development and productive land use in our state.
Thank you. Yes, the standard allocation that we were getting prior to the investment, the IIJA Act, we were able to complete about 20 assessments per year, in addition to our planning activities and the technical assistance and grant-funded technical assistance we were providing throughout the cleanup process. With the additional funding we received, we were able to go up to 145 assessments over those grants. So that's a significant increase in an actual assessment and some cleanup work done in our communities, and that prepared them to apply for full cleanup grants from both our state program and the federal program. We have both the staff and the contractors available to do more work. It's only a matter of how many dollars we get per year. Our standard allocation has been dropping slightly every year as more entities have been applying, and it was a great benefit to the state. The state program is very robust. There's about $125 million in state cleanup dollars awarded the last 4 years, I believe, and it's oversubscribed every year. So there's a significant need in the state, and our program is small in comparison, the state EPA Brownfield program is small in comparison to our state development's Brownfield program, but we're there to help all the communities that need that extra assistance, the ones that, need to find a first step, need the roadmap that helps them match dollar for dollar. And that's where our program really shines, is being kind of the matching dollars for other programs.
Well, thank you very much for that. And if I can help lift up some of the testimony I've heard from all of you, this is not just about the environment and cleaning up sites, which is very important, but this is about economic development, putting people to work, making sure that we're using our land productively and giving people an opportunity throughout our country, and particularly in Ohio's 13th and across the state. So thank you very much for your testimony. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Knott for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all the witnesses, thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Larson, I want to start with you. In regards to your experience and observations, what's the greatest impediment to having an efficient, I would say, remediation program for some of these environmentally sensitive sites in the Brownfield program? Is it local bureaucracy? Is it local permitting? Is it federal bureaucracy? Is it funding? Is it, if there's one thing you could point to, what would that be?
So regarding the cleanup duration or complexities at any given site is going to be highly dependent upon site-specific circumstances.
Sure.
So I would say it's going to be very challenging to point to a single factor, whereas there may be multiple factors, including the ones that you listed. Even from like a technical or scientific standpoint, many of these properties, the conditions may be unknown with respect to the environmental contamination that may or may not be present. And so as this process proceeds of investigating the contamination, investigating the site, if it turns out to be, contamination presents more of a risk than was originally envisioned, that could present more complications with respect to both the cleanup and what could be suitable reuses for the site. So there's various factors, even as the process proceeds, that can complicate this.
Right. I mean, one of the concerns that I'm bringing to the table is from North Carolina, there's a $2 per ton municipal waste disposal fee that really is aimed at cleaning up these, they're called pre-regulatory landfills. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Mr. Goldstein, you're shaking your head, but basically it's a period of time where landfills were utilized and anything went in there, and many of them have been deemed hazardous. And the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality monitors these landfills, but I think there's 700 of them. But only one has been cleaned up, or two have been cleaned up in the last 20 years, roughly. And that's a trend that I've heard about throughout the country, that cleaning these up, putting them back into the marketplace is a real problem. Mr. Goldstein, I would defer to you in terms of if there is a way that we can efficiently identify, manage, and clean up these, or cap them, remediate, however you want to phrase it. Is there a model that you've seen at a local and state level that is efficient and provides the necessary certainty to move these quickly?
Thank you, Representative Knott. That's a great question, and I want to invoke a suggestion that the chairman made. The concept of rethinking, re-envisioning the grant program to provide community block grants, like community block grants to state governments, so state governments can get the money to where it needs to go more quickly. If there's a single limiting factor that makes these projects less efficient than they need to be, it's time. And the time associated with waiting for the grant window to open and to prepare and submit a grant application on a competitive basis and then get the money, that time is too long. There's too much delay. If we were to have that money go to the states and have the state agencies allocate those dollars to where they're needed, where the greatest need is, those dollars would get to the communities more quickly, and they would be spent more efficiently with less oversight and administrative bureaucracy.
Is there a way to incentivize local and state government to move on these sites? Because, for instance, in North Carolina, a lot of county and state operators are the ones who polluted the sites. And so in some ways, they're not incentivized to, whether it's undertake cleanup costs or to remediate, because that could expose them to further liability. But is there a way to really expedite this process using the federal leverage at hand? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
It absolutely makes sense. We've done something like that in the state of Florida, which I know Ranking Member Wilson is aware of. In Florida recently, we passed a law that essentially gives grace to local government entities that may have caused contamination to a site, provided that they bring it into productive reuse quickly and promptly, and that they find a public-private partnership opportunity to invest private sector dollars in the cleanup. That gives them, as I mentioned, grace and a runway without exposure to liability under the state's CERCLA analog.
do you think that's replicable federally?
It absolutely could be replicable on the federal level. There could be an exemption under CERCLA for exposure to costs under, for example, PFAS, that arise out of PFAS contamination, provided that the local government finds a private sector party to invest in redevelopment.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This program is a very good one. The recommendations that have been made are very helpful and useful, and hopefully we will put forth a reauthorization this year. I think we've done it at least once in the past 4 years, and perhaps we'll be successful this year on a reauthorization. The recommendations that have been made by the witnesses are all good, and so as we write this legislation, good for us. However, I have a problem. No, we have a problem. All of this runs through the EPA, and the president put forth a budget proposal, which I would hope the Congress of the United States, Senate and House would thoroughly and completely reject, but nonetheless his proposal is to reduce the EPA budget to its lowest level, which happened to be its first budget. Now, just how is that going to work? This committee has a very serious responsibility. This program and the CERCLA program also are critically important to our communities, to the health of the communities around it, and in some cases, to the larger regional areas. However, unless we have the courage to push back on what the administration is proposing, this is an interesting exercise, and we'll undoubtedly write a good reauthorization bill, and it will be of no consequence whatsoever. Now, I wish all the committee members were here, and when I talk to them individually, I'm going to say, yeah, it's nice. We'll do our work as we did it before. We have a model, and we'll use that, and we'll update it, given the suggestions of the witnesses. It'll be an interesting exercise of no purpose whatsoever if the administration has its way to gut the EPA. So I would hope all of us would keep this in mind while we work through this. Good for us. However, unless we're willing to fight the fight to fund the EPA at a level that would allow these programs and others to proceed, I guess we'll feel good about the work we've done, but it will have no consequence, no utility, and actually cause severe problems throughout the United States as we attempt to deal with this particular set of issues and dozens of others. So the fight is not here. The fight is on the proposals being made by the administration to gut the EPA and to reduce its funding to a level that is equal to what it was on its very first day of existence. Now, I happen to support the Brownfield programs. It's useful. We have in the city of Vallejo a $600,000 EPA grant for Mare Island, the first and oldest naval base on the West Coast, and you can kind of imagine the kind of contamination that's existed there over the last century and a half. So that's useful and making progress. It also allows for the downtown waterfront. City of San Pablo, another one, a rail yard that dates back to the 1800s. Yeah, there's a bit of a problem there, but the cleanup of that will allow the city to bring in housing into a historic area that has been, well, all of you know this, we all have these. 435 of us have problems, and the Brownfield program helps our districts. So each of us ought to be not only working on the reauthorization legislation and whatever changes are appropriate to improve it, but we're going to have to fight the big fight. Otherwise, why bother? I'm going to let it go at that. I thank the witnesses for their specific suggestions on how to improve the existing authorization, which now expired 2 years and a half ago. So we have work to do. But I don't want this committee and each and every one of us to forget what is the principal battle at hand, and that is, in fact, the existence of the EPA in a meaningful way. So with that, I'm going to yield back, Mr. Chairman, and I would hope to have your support in helping all of us, or making all of us aware of the problem that the administration is creating with its proposed budget cut for the EPA, and work with all of us to restore the funding to an appropriate level so this program and others can proceed. With that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Burleson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldstein, am I correct in saying you have over 3 decades of experience in helping local communities navigate the process of these cleanups of brownfields?
Yes, sir, and I feel every single one of those days.
Given that experience, could you walk me through the process that a local, county or community goes through when they're applying for assistance for a brownfield?
Sure. The process typically starts with a developer or a not-for-profit who, either working on their own or with a local government, identifies a site that would make a wonderful redevelopment project for whatever their mandate is, for whatever their constituents are telling them needs to be done. They'll conduct some due diligence that
typically doesn't take a lot of money to have a consultant perform what's called a Phase 1 environmental site assessment audit, which is a non-invasive study of the history of the site and the regulatory status. And more often than not, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area, you'll identify a legacy of chemical contamination, and all of the warning bells will go off, and the costs will be identified related to cleanup, related to third-party liability, related to the incremental things that you have to do to safely build on a contaminated site. And then people will take a beat and say, well, how are we going to pay for all of this? And at that point, many projects simply expire because the risk is too high and the costs are too uncertain. But in other instances where they are aware of the Brownfields program, they work with a local government or a not-for-profit. For-profit entities are not eligible for brownfield grants, and they get in the queue to receive EPA funding. Sometimes it's for assessment, sometimes it's for assessment and cleanup, sometimes it's for cleanup only. In many instances, those grants provide important seed money, but not enough to complete the job, because more often than not, these problems, as mentioned by a number of your colleagues, are very complex. They're not problems that can be solved with $100 or $200 or $300 or $400,000 in grant funding. Sometimes they take millions of dollars in grant funding, and sometimes grant funding, all of the money in the world wouldn't solve the problem. There need to be more liability protection tools, more regulatory tools to expedite cleanup, et cetera. But from identification of an issue through award of grant and the money becoming available, that window can take 9 to 12 to 18 months, and many projects don't have that time available to them.
Regarding the nonprofits, how does that relationship work? Are there just nonprofits that exist that this is their mission, they accept these grants, they work the process, and then they kind of align with a business?
Well, there are a variety of not-for-profits. Some are involved in the arts, some are involved in affordable or workforce housing, some are involved in providing urban farming opportunities. It really spans the gamut of what not-for-profits are interested in. And we've seen it all in a Brownfields context going back to 1995. Many times they can't go it alone. They don't have enough money, so they partner with local governments and seek these grants.
Thank you. Mr. Wilbur, this Congress is committed to, this committee plans to consider reauthorization of the Brownfields program. In the reauthorization, we will have the opportunity to consider whether the funds are given to the Brownfields program have achieved their intended purposes of the program. In your opinion, have the funds put towards this program achieved the intended purposes and the goals of the program?
I believe that they have, taking what I've seen in my county alone, with the investment that was made, we definitely have identified and assessed the brownfields that we know are there.
And given the funds that we're spending money, we're stewards of taxpayer dollars, are there examples or are there any opportunities where we can make sure that those dollars are used to their fullest extent? Is there any opportunities that we can make it better?
Well,
make it more efficient with the dollars we have?
Well, I would say that the administrative aspect of it, the burdensome of the reporting and all of that has definitely been an added chore for most rural counties. They have a small staff, like the chair noted before. I mean, we have one county attorney to work on this, and we have one chief accountant in the whole county. So the work is a lot, and the staff is limited. So that administrative duties are definitely a little burdensome for us.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose the Trump administration's attack on the Environmental Protection Agency. The agency has suggested it will return to staffing levels from the 1980s and President Trump's fiscal year 2026 budget would cut the agency's budget by 55%. These cuts to staffing and funding levels are grave threats to human health and the environment. I support the Brownfields program. The program is a win-win-win. It helps protect the environment and human health and spurs economic development. Mr. Goldstein, how would reduction in funding for the Brownfields program affect environmental justice efforts?
Well, without in Florida, they would go away completely because Florida doesn't have any funding for environmental justice directly. The Florida Brownfields Redevelopment Act mentions environmental justice, but there's never been a funding mechanism. I agree with you, Representative. The people at EPA are dedicated, they're hardworking, they're exceedingly efficient, both in the Brownfields program, and we haven't mentioned it, but the Superfund redevelopment program. Brownfields and Superfund redevelopment pray in the same pew. They are both important objectives and both tremendous opportunities for economic revitalization, public health protection, and environmental justice. If we're going to take money out of the Brownfields program, all of these efforts are, as I mentioned earlier, are going to come to a grinding halt. But I do want to say this. Brownfields has always been bipartisan. It's received a lot of bipartisan love. The money that gets allocated by Congress to Brownfields goes through EPA, but doesn't stay in EPA. It goes to the communities where that money is needed and where over the past 35 years, it's made all the difference in the world. If you look at the leveraging data published by EPA, and I'm sure that Mr. Larson has looked at this as well, every dollar invested by Congress creates a return on investment of $20 in private sector investment. I've actually seen that order of magnitude be 40 to 60 times. I mentioned a project in Ranking Member Wilson's district where EPA allocated $400,000 in 128A grant funding, and the developer is putting in $217 million. But separate and apart from that, there are things that Congress can do, that this subcommittee can do in terms of liability protection and process that will also make private capital more likely to go into brownfield sites, even if the level of EPA, even if the level of brownfield funding isn't what it has historically been until it can come back. Create liability exemption for PFAS, circular liability exemption for PFAS cleanups, for example, where the cleanup is being conducted at the state level. Increase the amount of low-income housing tax credits available for affordable housing, and pass the federal brownfield tax incentive as part of the tax bill.
Thank you. Ms. Shook, based on the success of the Brownfields program in Ohio, how can cities best leverage partnerships among governments, the private sector, and communities to maximize the program's benefits?
Many of our communities do just that. They work with both the state to get their get initial assessments done, leveraging the funding we have with our state brownfield program, and then they go on to apply for their own grants themselves. Relieving the burden of these cleanups, we have a robust land bank program in Ohio, so our counties take on a big lift in getting these cleanup dollars and getting the cleanups done so that they can attract the businesses and the private development. Sometimes they're working in partnership with private developers. Sometimes they're ahead of the game and are cleaning up these sites in advance of having a known end user. So they have all the work done, they've done the environmental work, and then they can, advertise and bring in new jobs to their communities with all of the funds that they've leveraged over the years.
Finally, Mr. Larson, how would an extended reauthorization of the Brownfield program improve its effectiveness?
Well, you have, to the extent that Congress would decide to reauthorize the program, you potentially, you can revisit some of the the programmatic elements that was amended in prior reauthorizations. So it gives Congress the opportunity to look at potentially revisiting or considering certain legislative options to amend the program to change or modify how it's currently operating, or if they want to change other aspects.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panelists today here. Thank you for weighing in on this. I wanted to go with Mr. Wilbur. Under the CERCLA policy, the issue of strict liability, how much of a chilling effect does that have on future owners, people that might want to come in and make something out of one of these problem areas, one of these brownfields, and for something that they didn't do in the past, or heaven forbid that they bought something without knowledge of it and then all of a sudden are left holding the bag. Talk a little bit about the what kind of chilling effect that, to the extent that the liability goes these days for the effort to develop and up the pace on the cleanup of an area.
Well, to the extent of my experience with this program, I haven't really been into the liability end of this. I know Mr. Goldstein had a lot to say on that in the beginning. When we administer these grants programs that have been given to our county from the federal government, we go out and we identify and assess the properties. We acknowledge that those are the brownfield sites. And then at that point in time, if we're successful in getting a phase 2 grant and we're able to remediate, then it's basically, they go through the assessment again and make sure that it's clear to be put back on the market or be developed.
What I'm getting at, though, is the overall, the way the strict liability is interpreted. Is it too much of a chilling effect on people wanting to do work other than just leave it static? Or is there something that, I guess let me ask, should something be done legislatively to make a stronger incentive and less of a negative on taking on one of these projects, one of these areas?
Well, it's definitely
For development,
Yeah, it's definitely a deterrence, I would say, for developers in our area. And I honestly, I don't know too much more other than as a person that would be looking to develop myself, I wouldn't want to be taking on some of the
Can you think
liabilities
of
that
any
wasn't
steps
remediated.
Congress should do to make it better?
I couldn't hear that question, sir.
Can you think of any steps Congress could do to make it better?
Off the top of my head, I cannot, but I can talk to some of my people and submit
Okay,
after.
thank you. All right. Mr. Larson, how much success have we had on, if you have these stats or an idea of recovering brownfields and other problem areas like that? We've got them in Northern California where certain activities went on in the 60s and 70s and such, and there's a groundwater problem, but it's an idle field right now, and you hope the remediation is making it work out as far as cleaning the water, cleaning the land. How much success has we had with the various federal programs since it's really become conscious in recovering many across the country?
Yeah, so regarding kind of the success or success metrics, as you've probably heard from a variety of different points today, there's a variety of different metrics that are commonly cited regarding both acreage under the Brownfields program that have been recovered, or jobs created. So certainly in the Brownfields program, when they're talking about a success metric, it's something where it has to do with recovered acres or completed sites.
Can you cite, and I don't expect you to have an exact statistic, but has there been many successful recoveries that these lands are now going from useless to something?
Regarding the federal brownfields grants, so the 104K competitive grants, to my understanding, the most recent data that I was able to find for FY 2024, I believe it was somewhere around 12,000 properties that have been, or sites under that program specifically that were recovered for reuse, and somewhere in the ballpark of 40,000 site assessments performed with those specific grant programs. Certainly, the state programs may have different numbers or different numbers for some of the sites that they've assessed, but that's just talking about the Brownfields program and not other authorities like Superfund or other types of cleanups.
Is primarily the conversion from a useless brownfield site, are they mostly going for industrial uses? Are we finding that it's successful to not necessarily put housing on that, or obviously schools or hospitals or things, but are they primarily going into industrial use that has a low interaction with these possible problems with, you know, unlike residents, let's say?
Probably the most, broadest way to answer the question is to say that typically reuse decisions and land use decisions are largely up to local communities and local governments who are responsible for, zoning, or, if you have private partnerships or private interests in those types of redevelopment or certain types of industries. So it could depend upon the site, and it can depend on the condition of the site and what those goals are for.
All right, I need to yield. Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Poe for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Collins, and Ranking Member Wilson for holding this hearing today. As my home state of New Jersey shoulders a heavy burden of industrial and hazardous waste, as a member from the state with the highest number of Superfund sites and a significant number of brownfields, I know well the importance of the environmental remediation. The New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection has identified at least 45 brownfield sites in my district alone. We must continue to support communities that transform contaminated properties into usable spaces. For example, the Patterson Great Falls National Historic Park was tainted by centuries of industrial waste. The Brownfield program offered a lifeline to address the former Allied textile plant within that park and to promote public health and a cleaner environment. The EPA's environmental funding is essential, truly essential for communities struggling with generating the tax revenue needed to redevelop abandoned or blighted properties. The program showcases the strength in a public-private partnership that benefits everyone. Federal and state partners, businesses, environmental communities, we really need to do something, and we need to make sure to preserve these very, very important communities. New Jersey is experiencing a significant affordable housing shortage. Mr. Goldstein, in your testimony, you cite low-income housing tax credit as one of the tools to facilitate affordable housing construction on a former brownfield sites. Can you please elaborate on how smaller brownfield sites like those in densely populated states like New Jersey can be redeveloped within these with these particular tax credits? And if you would also share with us what are some of the challenges that are associated with brownfield developments in those particular urban areas?
Absolutely, and I'm prepared to speak for the next 3 or 4 hours on those questions.
Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time, but
Yes,
I
ma'am.
am very
I'll
eager to
be
hear
as brief
your
as I
response.
can. The first challenge is really making sure that the cleanups are sufficient, that there is the proper amount of regulatory oversight and transparency, because there historically has been a lot of questions about the sufficiency of cleanups on Superfund sites and brownfield sites that have been used for housing. But many states do that well. Many local regulatory agencies do that well, and certainly EPA can and has done that well. That's number one. We want these sites to be cleaned up to the standard that they need to be cleaned up to make them safe for residential use. That's number one. Number two, the low-income housing tax credit program is one of the most successful financing programs that underlie and support affordable housing all across the country. But there's not enough money in LIHTC to cover the incremental cost and risk associated with environmental cleanup. In order to perform sufficient cleanups, we need more money to affordable housing developers. One way to do that outside of the grant program is through the low-income housing tax credit program. In my written materials, I have some very specific suggestions, but then within the context of the Brownfields program, make these grants available to private developers who are engaged in the development of affordable and workforce housing. Currently, grants are not available to that sector. And then finally, referencing the question from one of your colleagues, let's amend CERCLA to mitigate the harsh impact of strict liability and joint several liability so that parties who acquire contaminated sites for affordable housing development and clean those sites up under a state brownfields program have a complete defense against liability under CERCLA. That's what we have in Florida, that type of liability bar, but you have to do the cleanup. It's a quid pro quo. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Onder for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses being here today. Mr. Goldstein, you've described Florida's Brownfields program as a national model, citing its use of state-level incentives and liability protections, efficient permitting. From your experience, do you believe the federal government should play a role mostly by supporting and empowering states to tailor solutions rather than expanding Washington's control over brownfield projects?
Well, I think there remains a very vital role for EPA to play. Number one, they engender their mere presence in connection with complicated cleanups engender a lot of public confidence. So that's number one. Number two, they bring a lot of expertise to the table, and they have a lot of experience, and all of that is valuable. They also are very efficient, in my experience, both in the brownfields context and in the Superfund redevelopment context, as acting as almost concierge consultants to help local governments and neighborhood stakeholders and developers and their lenders and capital providers understand how to navigate all of the regulatory issues and where the bumps in the road are from an environmental perspective and a public health perspective. And then in terms of actually bringing dollars to bear, well, that's an important role as well. But they should be in equal partnership with state regulators and local regulators.
You brought something up that I was wondering about when it comes to lenders. Are lenders often hesitant to loan money where there's a brownfield redevelopment?
That's correct. Even the slightest whisper of a hint of a shadow of environmental risk tends to send conventional lenders fleeing because they don't understand these issues. They hear a lot about CERCLA and other federal programs and state liability programs. They hear the horror stories, and it's much easier to lend on a clean site, and it's much better for job security. So it's an existential issue, and it's a bit of a catch-22 or catch-21, whatever the catch is, because projects need financing in order to get over the environmental hurdle, but they can't get the financing until they get over the environmental hurdle, which is why I've suggested a Brownfields Loan Guarantee Fund as an opportunity.
Yes, okay, no, good. Yeah, so your support for reauthorization of the Brownfields tax incentive and new loan guarantee program sounds very reasonable, but at this time of a $36 trillion debt, we want to ensure that we're not just subsidizing risk or inflating costs. What accountability measures do you support to ensure these incentives go to high-performing, results-oriented sites and not less productive projects?
Well, I'm a data hound, so I like data. I like reporting and oversight and auditing. Those are those generate important metrics, and they hold grantees' feet to the fire and make sure that cleanups are efficient and cost-effective. There are other belt and suspenders we can add to that process, including requiring multiple bids for any particular project.
Sure. And, you advocate for increasing low-income housing tax credits for projects built on brownfield sites. That may, help with cleanup, but how do we ensure that we don't end up seeing mission creep where the brownfield programs just become another affordable housing vehicle as opposed to sticking to the primary mission of cleaning up brownfield sites?
Well, we've got a perfect storm of need in this particular public policy arena. We have a lot of sites that need to be cleaned up because they're engines of disinvestment, and they are orphaned in terms of responsible parties who have money and the willingness to conduct cleanup, and they provide a significant public health risk. So
Right.
that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a tremendous affordable housing crisis.
Right.
And so, from my perspective and my experience, what I'm seeing on the ground in Florida and in a Ranking Member Wilson's district is that there is almost an endless ocean of need that you could pour dollars into and not have mission creep.
Got it. Yeah. No, I know back home in the St. Louis metro area, I'm aware of a number of brownfield sites that are just prime real estate for commercial development or for housing, and they're just sitting vacant and at very low prices because of these issues. So, no, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Friedman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really appreciate all of the witnesses being here today. Listening to the conversation with the committee, it's very heartening to hear a conversation where you can't really tell what side of the aisle the committee members are. There seems to be a lot of certainly support for this program and an understanding of, I think, of the imperative to expand the program to really help these communities that have been suffering under the burden of polluted sites and to create the housing that we need. And I hope that there's an openness to expanding this program and putting the funding into it that we need. So the IIJA provides a total of $1.5 billion for the program, money that's directly benefited communities in the LA region. In my area in Los Angeles in 2023, the city of LA was selected for a brownfields cleanup grant provided by the IIJA. The grant funds are going to be used to clean up a site called Taylor Yards, which is an old railway line that sits in the middle of Los Angeles that would provide wonderful parkland for a very park-poor community. Also in 2023, the LA County Sanitation District was selected for a brownfield cleanup grant, also funded through the IIJA. And these cleanups are vital to our communities. A redevelopment of previously contaminated properties not only protects the health of our communities, but stimulates our local economies and creates jobs. I want to talk more about the housing impact, because that's the #1 crisis in Los Angeles, particularly now after the devastating fires where probably about 20,000 people at least lost their homes. And that was on top of an existing housing crisis. And I was really interested in your suggestions about how to make this program stronger. So I want to ask a couple of questions because I'm already running out of time. Whether there's anything that you can anticipate that helps cities pay for the infrastructure that they need, maybe water, sewer, that sort of things, on top of what the developers are putting in of their own money for these sites. If we want to create the housing that we need, sometimes we're going to have to upgrade the infrastructure going into the sites. Also, whether you support increasing the low-income housing tax credit under Section 42 of the IRS Code to 6% and 12% for affordable housing on brownfield sites, and whether you think that would have an impact. And whether a new and one-time low-income housing tax credit of 80% of the cost of land acquisition and demolition to develop affordable housing will be beneficial, and just anything else that we can take home with us to look at, because we do have this huge need to create affordable housing, and we have this program, so how do we make it work better? Mr. Goldstein, I think I'll ask you.
Thank you. I don't want to take all of your time, so I'll try and be brief. Yes to every recommendation you made with respect to the low-income housing tax credit. At those levels, at those percentages, that would be a tremendous incentive to the private affordable housing development sector
to invest in your area and in other similar areas across the country. Increasing federal funding for infrastructure, water, sewer especially, and roads, where brownfield sites and Superfund sites will be reused safely for affordable housing. That's number 2 with a bullet. And number 3 with a bullet, and I'm repeating myself, is let's drain some of the risk and anxiety out of CERCLA generally, and the application of CERCLA to PFAS specifically, because that's a coming storm, by creating an exemption, a blanket exemption under federal law for developers and lenders, provided that the developer and the local government are cleaning up under a state brownfields program. That keeps all of these sites out of the national priorities list and the national contingency plan and allows redevelopment to be more certain.
So I don't know if you're familiar with California's old redevelopment tax increment program that the state clawed back in about 2010. When I was in the California legislature, reintroduced some tax increment programs focusing on specific sites, particularly brownfields and blight. Is there anything that would be a similar scheme at the federal level? And I'm asking this not knowing the answer because I've been looking for some way to help encourage more of this redevelopment. Is there anything you can think of that would work in a similar way?
2 things come to mind immediately. Number 1, we could, Congress could, expand the New Markets Tax Credit Program to create carve-outs and expanded funded opportunities for brownfields generally and affordable and workforce housing on brownfields specifically. So that's number 1, the New Markets Tax Credit Program. And number 2, expand the Opportunity Zone program specifically for brownfields and as a sub-specifically for housing on brownfields. But I will say this, not just housing alone, because there's a mixed-use component that historically has traveled with brownfields that gives you two bites at the apple. One is housing for people who need it, and number 2 is job creation opportunities. That's the mixed-use component where you have commercial, retail, or industrial.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Hurd for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Collins and Ranking Member Wilson, for holding this hearing on the Brownfields program. I have the pleasure of serving as the chairman of the House Natural Resources Indian and Insular Affairs Subcommittee. And in that capacity as that subcommittee chair, I'm interested in learning how this program benefits our tribal communities in Indian country. And the EPA's Brownfield program has provided important funding in Indian country in remediating and revising these environmental sites. The Southern Indian Tribe in my district has used money to redevelop a brownfield site, for example, for now office space. That's one successful example of use of that program. But I've also heard that tribes can at times struggle to attract non-federal funding, particularly compared to counties or local governments. And so, Mr. Wilbur, I wanted to ask you, can you talk about specific challenges that you can think of that tribal governments face when accessing brownfields funds, and how might Congress better empower tribal communities' efforts to redevelop their sites?
Well, I'll take a stab at it here. Definitely, in county government, we have a lot more resources than some of our tribal partners do. And I'll first preference by saying we can go back at NACO and we can reach out to some of our tribal communities and get you that information so you will have accurate data on that as well. But let's just go back to where I was starting, that yes, there is a significant challenge, whether it be staffing to apply for these grants, and oftentimes, the reporting on those, and then it's also trying to get developers to develop in those areas too. Some are very, very rural, more rural than my area or other parts of, the Midwest even, so.
Do you have any ideas how tribal communities might attract more non-federal funding for these projects as a way that we could facilitate that while maybe respecting tribal sovereignty? Any ideas there?
Off the top of my head, I would say no, but we can definitely get you some answers back on that, sir.
Okay, very good. Mr. Goldstein, question for you. The Inspector General found that millions of dollars in brownfields funding, brownfields revolving loan fund dollars, have sat idle across EPA regions. From the private sector perspective, what are the key barriers to deploying that capital?
That's a great question. I've had experience with this specifically in South Florida. What we've seen is that, frankly, the RLF grantees, the revolving loan fund grantees, tend to want to put that money out at too high an interest rate. They're looking for too high of a return, which to me goes against the public policy associated with those grant funds. The purpose, as I understand it, or as I would like it to be, is to get those funds into the hands of communities and developers as quickly as possible so those funds can be put to work and those sites can be cleaned up and repurposed. Interestingly, the RLF, the revolving loan fund grant that goes to eligible entities, not inclusive of private developers, once those funds are received by the RLF grantees, they can be loaned out to private developers. And we have used those, our clients, and my development company has used that funding. But it's been slow going for most RLF grantees, typically because they're asking for too much in terms of an interest rate. So what I would like to see, if I may, is a requirement from Congress imposing a cap on the amount of interest that can be charged. It's important that the money be paid back so that the money can be put back out on the street. That's the whole concept of a revolving loan, but not at an interest factor that makes it uncompetitive or punitive. We want to lower barriers to redevelopment for private developers.
What would you suggest how that cap would be formulated, just out of curiosity?
I'm sorry?
How would that cap be formulated? Any ideas what that might look like?
I would like, best case scenario would be a 0% interest loan. That money would fly out the door and it would be put immediately to use.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Goldstein. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Skolton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Collins and Ranking Member Wilson, and to our esteemed witnesses for joining us here today and for your incredible work on this issue. Michigan is the beating heart of this country's manufacturing operations, and while that is an immense source of pride for our state, unfortunately, careless disposal of hazardous materials associated with that heavy manufacturing has left my home state with nearly 24,000 contaminated sites, all while being nestled right next to the largest freshwater resource in the entire world. The first source of attack, of course, should always be holding bad actors accountable who have polluted and need to clean up their messes. But when they're not, these properties are thrust on the shoulders of taxpayers and local governments to clean up and repurpose. Unfortunately, the EPA's brownfield programs have provided, fortunately, the EPA's brownfield programs have provided communities with the resources necessary to catalyze the redevelopment and safely address these pollutants. The bipartisan infrastructure law built on this progress, directing $9 million in federal grants funding to Michigan alone, has shown just how effective these programs can be. These investments have remedied the wrongdoings of the past while preparing the state to innovate and preserve its manufacturing legacy. My first question, in addition to encouraging environmental stewardship, the Brownfield program is also a key tool, as I mentioned, to revitalize these communities. I share the chairman's concerns about fiscal responsibility. In fact, I stand on fiscal responsibility. It is essential that we spend our taxpayer dollars in an effective manner. Throughout Michigan, we have seen how fiscally responsible investment in this program can be. Redeveloped properties have ushered in new jobs, increased local tax bases, and stimulated neighborhoods. You know, these investments are an incredible use of taxpayer dollars, reinvesting money right back into these communities. Ms. Shook, can you speak to how redevelopment of blighted properties is an effective use of taxpayer dollars and how it benefits local economies across the country?
Thank you. Investment in our communities really can allow the locals to reinvent how their communities have developed, whether it be built around a former, auto manufacturing site, which we also have many of in Ohio, to see them think differently about how they want it to look in the future, whether it be mixed use and housing or a new commercial development completely. They can change the, health effects in the community from having dangerous, contaminants available for exposure to their communities to a new productive use. So we've seen a variety of projects come through, especially through our voluntary cleanup program, that have created brand new metro parks in areas that were otherwise industrial histories. You'll see that on the Lake Erie riverfront and a few of our different communities. To moving back, the commercial developments a block away so that you can keep your park space available and have all those recreational and tourism aspects. And then you have new commercial, vibrant businesses opening, new office spaces, new restaurants that drive visitors to your communities. It can be a true catalyst to getting people back into your neighborhoods.
I think your testimony speaks for itself, and it's essential to be asking as we look to these cuts, why? Why are we saying we can't afford this right now, right? We have choices to be made in this country, and while on the one hand we are allowing massive tax breaks to major corporations, we're saying we can't afford this incredibly fiscally responsible investment back into our communities. To me, it seems like we can't afford not to. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. DeSalinen. I'm sorry I butchered that.
Obviously, you took French in high school, because that was great.
It was a McDonald's. It was called French fries.
I respond to anything close to it. Well, thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Goldstein, I wanted to ask you a question. I represent an area in the San Francisco Bay Area, the county I've represented for a long time at the local, state and federal level. I was an air regulator, but worked closely with the Regional Water Quality Board. We have the highest industrial and hazardous materials sites on the West Coast by concentration geographically and population, because the Bay Area is very populated. But because of the access to deep water ports, it's really crucial, particularly to the petroleum industry. There are 5 refineries. They're mostly in Mr. Garamendi's district, but have been in mine in my various service. So what's happening is, and also Northern California is transitioning very rapidly, mostly from market rate in terms of renewable fuels and alternative energy cars. So we've got one refinery that just announced last week or 2 weeks ago, the Valero refinery in Benicia, California. Now, these 5 refineries produce 25% of the CARB-certified fuel in California and 50% of the diesel fuel, so the ripple effect. So there's, Superfund sites, brownfield sites. Most of the property in the Bay Area doesn't get deserted. We have had brownfield sites. But it's the interaction between these that I'm interested in, where the liability is when venture capital companies decide to come in and buy a big hazardous materials site because it's not worth what it was 10 years ago. And as they see the transition happening, largely because of the private sector, in spite of some of my colleagues saying it's regulatory, there is regulatory enforcement that I support and appropriate. So that's sort of my broad question is, in this case with Valero, I think they're leveraging. The local city council has been very demanding on them, but there's a lot of demand to come in and buy the property. But in that transition, whether it's Brownfields, Superfund, public oversight at the state or the local level, we've had a lot of problem with the Regional Water Quality Board, where the business model seems to me in some of these places that have been bought now and are just going to one plant that was bought, they said we bought it for spare parts because we know there's a limited time frame to this refinery. So discharge petitions and what's going into the Bay Delta, all of that sort of intersects with brownfields. Are they going to leave the site? Prospectively, they could. So I'm just curious if you had any view, and I realize this specific hearing, but it intersects with the larger economic pressure where we're changing a lot of our use to hazardous material sites in areas that have concentrations of them. And it has a lot of impact on environmental justice as we've switched in California to talk about the cumulative effects. So back to this hearing, it's a small potential portion of the overall conversation I'm trying to have with you. But if you have any thoughts in particular about this and where it might be something that we have to think about of supporting it. And then lastly, Region 9, where EPA is headquartered in the West Coast, has been a target in the first administration where he actually moved the administrator out of the offices and has pushed for early buyout. So we don't have the resources we used to have in Northern California and on the West Coast because Region 9 is being abandoned, particularly at EPA.
So for these types of sites where you have a very significant history of use of acutely hazardous materials that are likely widespread, creating significant public health risk and questions regarding the confidence that the public will have in the completeness and thoroughness of the cleanup, that illustrates the need for a very vital and vibrant regulatory dimension to go hand in glove with all of the economic incentives that will be necessary to encourage the private sector to do most of the heavy lifting associated with that magnitude of cleanup. And so if you're asking me what my view is of that type of scenario, which is played out all over the country, it's that the Brownfields program is multidimensional. It's not just about grants. It's not just about liability protection. It's not just about private capital coming in or regulatory oversight to protect public health. It's all of that. And so there's not one particular box that this committee can or should check and expect that the momentum that has been achieved since the mid-1990s will be maintained. Put another way to bring this answer in for a landing, we need to continue to have strong regulatory oversight at the federal level when the issues are exceedingly complex and may have a federal component, a multi-state component, also state and local regulatory oversight on the one hand, and then all of the financial tools and the liability tools on the other.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, it's really interesting to see as these big billion-dollar assets from the private sector become less of an asset and more of a liability from the financial model, and where it's appropriate for us in Congress to be. And all of these refineries heretofore were very high performing in their total portfolio, partially because the public demanded it.
One last point on your question, which is a great question, and I think this may be what you're getting at. As these billion-dollar assets transition to billion-dollar liabilities, there are funds out there, very significantly resourced funds that will rush to fill that gap and make the safe transition, but they need the right regulatory environment in which to do that. And in that sense, while regulatory oversight to protect public health is critical, we also need the appropriate opportunities from a CERCLA perspective to, as I mentioned earlier, drain the anxiety out of potential enforcement.
Yeah, I want to thank the chairman for indulging us, but I'll just close with this. The property itself is worth a lot of money. There are developers who are interested with all liabilities. So the existing value of that liability still continues, and the local government has a lot of say because they have the land use jurisdiction. So it's a fascinating subject. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. You're fine. I was gonna open up for a second round of questioning right quick because personally I had a few questions of my own that I wanted to ask. So I'm gonna yield myself 5 minutes for questioning. I want to open up. Mr. Larson, can you give us the difference in a Superfund and a Brownsfield? And can a Brownsfield be a Superfund?
Sure, I'm happy to address the question and provide some points on that. So, like I mentioned in my opening statement, the Superfund program was established in 1980, largely in response to very high-profile cases where you had, a variety of hazardous waste sites and communities that were acutely exposed to various contamination, along with other factors that led to that enactment. And so as part of that, CERCLA established Congress under CERCLA established a liability framework for potentially responsible parties who are responsible for releasing those hazardous substances into the environment. And so when you're looking at the CERCLA framework under Superfund program, it is a cleanup program that's responding to releases of hazardous substances and other pollutants and contaminants into the environment. So you can think of it as it's an enforcement-first framework where EPA is looking to, under the Superfund program, they're looking to enforce liability first against potentially responsible parties to make them pay for the cleanup at the site. Whereas there are, not that we have time to get into it, but there's certain other mechanisms for sites that are elevated to the national priorities list. You have additional federal funding mechanisms through the Hazardous Substance Superfund Trust Fund for those types of sites. For the Brownfields program, it was set up and it's authorized within CERCLA, but it provides, it's primarily a grant-based program for these eligible entities and these eligible sites that's intended to both, as we've been speaking about, provide some economic assistance or financial assistance for these specific projects, but in addition to that, to provide liability exemptions so that you have, we talked about there's the current and former owners and operators of the site. You also have strict liability and joint and several retroactive to the time of release.
And I think that's where I want to pick up from there, and it's a good segue into my next question with Mr. Goldstein. Can you quantify the loss of investment from private sector just because of that liability problem that they perceive or they may have?
I can't do it scientifically, Chairman, but I can speak from experience. I can tell you what I have a gut-based answer.
Mm-hmm.
And in Florida alone, we've probably seen close to $1 billion in avoided transactions as a result of potential exposure to CERCLA liability. That's just one person's environmental practice over a 33-year time frame. You could probably multiply that by several orders of magnitude.
Thank you. Ms. Shook, I was listening to someone else's testimony. Are all sites to be cleaned to a residential use? Or is it like a commercial and residential?
We do not clean all sites to a residential use. In our voluntary cleanup program, we have standards for both commercial sites and for residential sites. We allow the end user to determine which land use they are interested in. Any site could be residential with the right amount of funding.
Thank you, thank you. And one last question, I'll open this up to everybody. Are we adding sites continually, or has it stopped? I mean, at some point, we should be able to hold people liable for messing up the land like that. I mean, I can understand things that were years and years ago, but are we still adding, or have we plateaued?
I'll take that. Yes, we are still adding. As businesses go under, as they file for bankruptcy, while we can try to hold them accountable, they are often, overwhelmed with their liabilities and can't complete a cleanup. That's where the Brownfield program is. Many of our brownfields aren't massive, sites. A lot of them still are mom and pop gas stations, a dry cleaner, a former mechanic shop. And in many of those cases, you're never going to have an entity that can fund the cleanup that they were responsible for.
All right, thank you. I yield back. Mr. DeSania, did you have additional questions?
Just wanted to follow up sort of, again, on the same line. In looking at going forward, where we have such a large part of potential brownfield sites in the country around energy transition, what could we do better so that we could avoid these liability issues to make sure that we anticipate this huge transition? The fifth of the economy, in my view, is happening, and I just happen to be in a region that leads it in many ways. What do you think, from your experience, Mr. Goldstein, where we could sort of go upstream and protect the revenue for brownfield, but anticipate these huge transitions we're going through on hazardous material sites related to energy?
Thank you for the question. A few thoughts. Number one, enforcement at the federal level and at the state level remains a critical public policy need, because without a cop on the beat, people are going to do what people tend to do, which is take shortcuts. Now, not everyone will do that, but enough people will do that that will continue to see the volume of impacted sites increase. And sometimes things happen not because people intend them to, but that's just the way it goes in industry and business. But to get ahead of the game, which is I think what you're getting at, what Congress can do is a lot of what we talked about today: improve the process, shorten the time frame from which a party applies for a grant and that money gets to where it needs to go. That's number one. And number two, put in place more statutory tools to create broader exemptions from liability so that private capital will feel more comfortable investing in these risky sites. The best way to get ahead of the game is to incentivize private parties to tackle these problems sooner than later so that we don't discover 10 years down the road that we could have done something 10 years earlier.
And just a follow-up question, having served at every level of government and having started as a Republican, some of my colleagues are always shocked to hear that, but parties change, is the inefficiency of sometimes, speaking in California, although I love it, is the federal regulators, particularly vis-a-vis Region 9, that used to work closely with California and local government. What could we do to coordinate that, knowing that the modeling shows that these facilities in places like I represent are changing because of the private sector? So coordination of the regulatory agencies is a frustration for me. They all do a good job, but their coordination is not very effective.
Well, in terms of environmental redevelopment, there's a model at the federal level that is somewhat dormant. The Federal Brownfields Partnership, in theory, a number of the federal agencies are supposed to be coordinating all of their brownfield resources. The Army Corps of Engineers, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, and so on. That rarely happens, unfortunately. Going forward, it would be wonderful to have that type of coordination, not just among the federal partners, but among state partners as well, to identify some of these larger transitional projects so that all of the agency stakeholders can collaborate with local government officials and the developers who are bringing the capital to the table.
And as far as the modeling goes, just getting DOE, Department of Transportation, EPA, resources all to have communication, at least in Region 9, they were pretty good, but they still just working across sister agencies at the federal level and then working with the state and the regional agencies and local agencies was always pretty inefficient and largely stoved up. So for the private sector, it was not very efficient. So the degree, if there's anyone on the other side of the aisle who would like to work with someone like myself on this, I think it could be very helpful. And then we wouldn't have to use brownfield monies because we'd get far enough ahead of it that we could stop people from having the liability of walking away. Thank you,
I think Brownfields grants will always have an important role to play, at least at the very inception of a project.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there any further questions from any other members? Not seeing anyone in here. That's going to conclude our hearing for the day. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. The subcommittee stands adjourned.